We're going to get started here at the top of the hour, and I'm happy to have so many folks have joined us for this topic. There was a report, some research and a report that's been recently completed under the title of the webinar, Managing Stormwater in Redevelopment and Greenfield Development Projects Using Green Infrastructure, the Economic Factors that Influence Developers' Decisions. And I'm pleased to have the two authors and researchers, Ed McMullen and Sarah Rich from Echo Northwest here in Oregon, with us today to go over the report, the findings of the report, and be available for questions. Before we get started with Ed and Sarah, however, I wanted to give two folks an opportunity, two folks who were representing American Rivers and Smart Growth America, who were the principal instigators behind this report. So I wanted to give Jeff Odefee with American Rivers and John Zeidler with Smart Growth America a chance to talk a little bit about the history of, not the history, but how this came to be and what we're trying to get out of this research, and perhaps it will motivate some questions. So Jeff, I'd like you to start off if you would.
Take it away. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming together today and joining us for this. I think, as Gail indicated, Ed and Sarah are really the stars of today's show. So I see it, John and I can provide a little bit of context, and then let Ed and Sarah give you the details and lead you through the progress of their research and the results. I think the important context for us at American Rivers was the emergence of EPA's ongoing efforts to update or revise the national stormwater regulations, and our recognition that if we're going to use this opportunity to kind of push for strong reforms, which include post-construction stormwater performance standards, that would really have a significant, I think, impact on the way we build our communities and shape both new construction projects as well as efforts to revise or retrofit redevelopment projects. And in doing so, of course, we're very aware that in shaping these communities, there are other considerable interests at stake, including the longstanding and very valuable efforts of the folks in the what we sometimes perceive as the smart growth community. I think there's often a bit more of a rhetorical or perceived divide than there is in many cases. We all have shared interest in strong, vibrant communities that are centered around really healthy waterways. So in moving forward with our work on the EPA rule, it became very clear to us both that we needed to work closely with the smart growth advocates as well as start to understand some of the underlying causes and effects of stormwater regulations, and whether there was anything to further illuminate this kind of perceived or real difference of opinions about the role of stormwater regulations in shaping communities and perhaps providing.
Jeff, excuse me, some folks are having trouble hearing you. I think you might have
am I speaking softly to myself? I'm sorry. So, what we were really trying to do in this case was to, build better relationships amongst the two communities, the smart growth community and the water advocacy community, and at the same time start to better understand the dynamic of regulations in both shaping communities and protecting waterways. And with the generous support of a pool of funders, we embarked on a joint research project to kind of fill in the details. There's been a lot of anecdotal indication that strong stormwater regulations may provide disincentives for urban redevelopment or infill development, but we really found that there was kind of a paucity of data about this subject, and knowing that we would benefit and become smarter, better informed water advocates, as well as start to provide some information for better smart growth advocacy. John's organization, Smart Growth America, and American Rivers, together with NRDC River Network and the Center for Neighborhood Technologies, worked with Ed and Sarah to shape this research project. I think we're really pleased with the results. It certainly gave us the beginnings of an education. We're starting to better understand the dynamic in a select handful of communities between urban infill redevelopment projects and stringent stormwater standards. Let's see. I think the last thing I think I'd add is really to talk about how we see this research as benefiting or informing our further work. It's certainly been very valuable in helping to provide a message to EPA about what we think the shaping of the stormwater regulation will do to a national revised set of rules, and creating a strong performance standard for post-construction stormwater management. It's also been very well received, or at least with a degree of interest amongst advocates in both the smart growth and water communities, and in state and public utilities around the country, I think. It's really a first step. I think the main lesson we've learned is, hey, there's a lot more to learn here. We'd like to get an even more detailed understanding of the role of not just stormwater regulations, but the shape, what particular shapes may be more effective in protecting urban waters, as well as kind of creating opportunities for infill development. And hopefully we'll have a chance to keep that line of research going. John, do you want to take it away from there?
Yeah, sure. And I just, I guess one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is just a little bit more of the background of the debate, or what the concern was, I think, that kind of drove this, and that is this kind of long-standing discussion within the environmental community, meaning, and by that I mean between the smart growth and water quality groups, traditional water quality groups, about the kind of the argument, or the concern was that a standard that was, for those who aren't aware of what the debate is, that a standard that's applied uniformly, a strong standard that's applied uniformly in a redevelopment in a greenfield development context, could have the potential impact of driving more development to greenfields, which could result in a whole host of environmental ills, including increased loss of open space and water and air pollution. And the theory being that these controls, putting them in place in a redevelopment context, is more expensive than employing them in a greenfield context, and that would just create an additional incentive for developers to move out into the greenfields. And we've been going back and forth on this for a while and trying to figure out what the contours of this potential impact are, if any. And in the course of kind of having this debate, it's also been picked up by groups that advocate for development interests who aren't necessarily smart growth developers or environmental advocates, and used, unfortunately, to weaken or defeat stormwater rules around the country. And I think we felt now that the national rules really moving forward, it was imperative that we come together and try to come up with some kind of unified position that we could take both to the EPA and also to use to combat development interests that might come out against a stormwater rule. From Smart Growth America's perspective on this, I think I want to just kind of clarify, where our policy position, kind of what was driving our policy position on this is that when we look back on, 60 years or so, the last 60 years or so, we see a multitude of federal, state, and local tax and land use policies that have basically incentivized sprawling development patterns, which we see as being kind of at the root of so much of the environmental destruction that we're dealing with today. And our concern is that, when we have a new regulation that comes out that drives up costs, we need to start to think about, well, how is that going to impact development, and is that going to contribute or reinforce this kind of historical pattern of creating incentives for greenfield development and sprawl, and then creating barriers to doing the right thing in existing communities, and creating higher, better uses in those existing communities, at the same time taking degraded land and actually making it perform better and get greater water quality benefits. And that said, I think it's great. I want to reiterate what Jeff said, that at the end of the day, we're both on the same page. We're trying to get stronger water quality protections and as much improvement as we can get in urban areas. From our side, we're kind of thinking about, well, how does the rule look that ultimately ends up promoting a policy that gets us better development in these urban areas and less loss of open land. I think Jeff and folks in American Rivers feel the same way. We just kind of coming at this and figuring out how to shape this, how to come at this rule to kind of bring this policy positions to the fore when we come to EPA. And I really want to thank Ed and Sarah for the terrific research that they did. I mean, it really did help us help move the ball on this, and we did come up with a policy position, a letter kind of interpreting the research that we sent to EPA together, and Gail along with Gail and NRDC and folks at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and it's really been terrific in helping us kind of begin to move forward as a group. I mean, I would also add, that there's still some disagreements, and we still have things that we have to work out on what we think this rule should ultimately look like. But the report has really been very helpful in moving us forward.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jeff. Everyone, folks that joined in after the beginning here, we were just listening to John Zeidler with Smart Growth America with a little bit of an introduction, and before that was Jeff Odefy with American Rivers. And now we're going to head over to the West Coast and and bring in Ed McMullen and Sarah Rich from Echo Northwest, and I don't know which one of you guys is starting, so I'll just turn it over to you and let you take it over.
Hi, this is Ed, and I'll be starting us off. I'll take us through some of the intro slides, but Gail, we're having trouble moving the slides.
Let's see.
Oh, there we go. We got it.
Did you do? I might have done that. Can you do that button in the bottom? Try it.
Yep, we got it.
We got it.
Okay.
So,
gotta love technology.
Thanks, Gail. So again, I'm Ed McMullen. I'll be starting us off through some of the early slides, and then my colleague Sarah Rich and I will trade off as we go through the conclusions. And
Ed, we might just mention to everyone that we'll be opening up for both taking in chat questions and verbal questions after each one of the conclusions, as well as after the opening information.
Yep, great. Thank you. Thanks, Gail. Sarah and I were really excited to do this study because it focuses on an area of stormwater management that we think is really important, but there's not a lot of work on it, and that is how do developers think about stormwater management, especially when there are new regulations that are such as these that we focused on that are requiring a lot more on-site infiltration, meaning, you know, they're not going to be allowed to put as much water in a pipe and just get it off the site. They're going to have to design the site and the structure so that to have a lot more infiltration on-site. And so this is in that aspect is a unique study from what we've seen before, and so that was really interesting to us to do this work. And on the slide on the screen now, this is, as John described, this is the analytical question we were focusing on. And so with more these stronger stormwater regulations that require more on-site infiltration, will they be more expensive? Will they be too expensive? Will the hassle involved cause developers to throw up their hands and say, you know what, we're going to quit doing these infill sites and we're going to move out to greenfield sites where it's easier to implement the new regulations and less hassle? So that was the question we focused on. Now, when we started this project, there are some things we thought that we already knew that would be relevant, and here are the main ones: that the costs and benefits of green infrastructure and or low impact development can be really site specific. It depends on these stormwater controls rely on things like soil type and the slope of the site and the type of vegetation, and that can influence their effectiveness and their costs. And given that these soil types, slopes, and vegetation can vary a lot across the country, it can really influence the costs and benefits of the green infrastructure. And another relevant point was that many factors influence developers' decisions. Some developers are going to focus on green field sites, some are going to focus on infill, some are going to focus just on green building, and they're going to track things like capital costs and land values and labor costs and costs of materials and also what's going on in the market. So they're tracking a whole bunch of things, and in that mix now we've kind of put in these new stormwater regulations. And as we'll see, our interviews with developers confirm that these issues are, they were relevant to their decision-making process and how they deal with the new regs. All right, so what we did and what we didn't do. What we did in this study is we focused on developers' decision-making processes and how they made decisions on meeting stormwater requirements. We conducted a literature review that helped us develop the conceptual framework so that we would more fully understand all the main factors that developers had to deal with. And then with that as background, we conducted interviews, key informant interviews, that I'll describe in a second here, to collect the main data for the study, or main information for the study. Now, what we didn't do, I want to be clear, this was not a study of costs or benefits of different types of green infrastructure or low-impact development. For example, we did not collect new information on what it costs to build a green roof or the economic benefits of the green roof. I just want to be clear on that issue. So, getting to the interviews, we worked with John Zeidler of Smart Growth America, helped us, and we selected 3 jurisdictions that had recently implemented relatively strong stormwater regulations, and by strong we mean that they required a lot more infiltration on site, meaning the stormwater really couldn't leave the site. It had to be managed on site. And we focused on 3 communities: Olympia, Montgomery County in Maryland, and Philadelphia. And we started by interviewing the permitting and planning staff in the jurisdictions just to get their take on the regulations, any feedback or thoughts they had on what they've heard out in the development community about the new regulations. They also helped us identify some folks to speak with. And then we interviewed folks who in the private sector who then have to conduct their business using these new regulations. So designers, builders, engineers, et cetera. And Gail, that takes us up to the, we were going to stop here if anyone had a question so far.
There's nothing.
All attendees have been unmuted.
You have been unmuted. Careful of what you say now. There has been no chat questions yet, so feel free to throw it out, or if anyone wants to just directly ask Ed a question, don't be shy. Okay, and you can also, if you want to raise your hand first, you can do that. Ryan talked about the raise hand function. I'm scanning, no hands, no questions about the selection of the locations or about the question of the research yet? Oh, Tim is typing. How were the builders selected?
We kind of like, how to describe it? Kind of like word of mouth. I mean, we would talk to folks. Folks in the community, starting with the permitting planning staff. John Zeidler had some insights on some folks. We actually, when we first started doing some of the interviews, that was one of our interview questions: who else should we speak with? We tried to get a range, not just focus on folks who did green building or folks who didn't do green building. We tried to get small, large, not just builders, but also designers, engineers, and this was primarily word of mouth, I think. Talking to folks and getting their insights and compiling a list, and then following up with those who wanted to be interviewed. It turns out I don't think we ever got turned down by anyone.
Tim asks, how do you know they were truly representative of the community at large? In other words, so assuring statistical significance.
Right. And that's a very good question. This is not a statistical valid survey of the universe of developers, even in these 3 communities. I want to be clear about that point, that these are case studies in 3 locations. We did try to get a representative sample, but we didn't have enough information to do a complete statistical survey. And that probably would have killed our whole budget, just doing that. And so again, we had limited resources, and so our interest was to try to get a representative sample, but not a statistically, significant sample.
Okay, that's important. And it was also constrained by time, though, too, Ed, because this, as others have said, this research was intended and still is intended to inform what's going on with the EPA stormwater regulation in development. So that we were very cognizant of the timing and trying to get it done really quickly, and poor Ed and Sarah heard that a lot. So that's an important point too. With that, I think it makes sense to start with the conclusions because everyone's on the edge of their seat waiting to hear what came out of the research.
Okay, our first.
All attendees have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
I don't know who that woman is, but she's very helpful. Oh.
Okay, okay, I think we're unmuted, or Sarah and I are unmuted. So our first conclusion, we wanted to put right up front what we think is the most relevant point specific to the analytical question that some developers are incorporating the stormwater controls, the new stormwater controls in both greenfield and redevelopment projects. No one we interviewed, either the jurisdiction staff or the developers, engineers, designers, et cetera, no one we interviewed and indicated that they were aware of a project that had not been implemented because of the stronger stormwater controls. In other words, no one had decided to drop a redevelopment project and do a greenfield project instead. In Philadelphia, where the regulations have been in place the longest, we got a sense that developers are adopting and learning the most efficient ways to comply with the regulations and still do infill and redevelopment projects. Now, I think this may come up later. I want to hasten that we conducted this survey against the backdrop of a very depressed market, building market, construction market, and so we do have to recognize that there wasn't tons. This was not like the go-go days of 2007 or even 06 before that, where there was tons of development. So there was development going on, but it was at lower levels than in the past.
I'll interject. It would be really interesting to repeat this study in 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Or, yeah.
Another, back to conclusion one, another point is that we took from our work is that redevelopment requires a different approach than greenfield development. Redevelopment requires a different set of skills. There are more constraints to a redevelopment project, and in general, those folks who do redevelopment have to be relatively flexible, and that flexibility helped when it came to implementing the new stormwater regulations in redevelopment context. And a last point, there are what we call off-ramps, meaning some wiggle room for parts of the stormwater regulations in redevelopment settings. So the regulators know that it's harder to implement in these types of situations, and so they are a little bit more pragmatic and more flexible, I should say, and pragmatic in trying to help folks deal with the new regs. So there's a little bit more wiggle room for some of the regulations in the redevelopment setting compared to greenfield.
Okay.
So this is. Do you want to take questions after each conclusion, or do you want to wait? There is one that came in by chat that relates to that last point, specifically about incentives.
Yep, I see that, and let's hold that one because we have a slide about that covers that in a little bit more detail.
Okay, I thought you might want to. Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want to hold on, just keep going on more conclusions before you take more questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Do that.
Feel free to type in, and we'll manage the chat, and then we'll open up again. Maybe after conclusion number 3, we'll open up the line.
Okay.
Okay. So conclusion number 2, and this sort of confirmed one of the hypotheses that we had going into this project, that complying with stormwater regulations is one factor among many that influences a project's costs and developers' decisions. It is really the driving factor. We often heard people say that, stormwater controls are typically way down the list of things that we consider when we're penciling out a project. There are other things. In Pennsylvania, a lot of the developers we talked to commented that labor costs were a huge factor in whether a project could go forward or not. Other things that were mentioned commonly were the density and zoning regulations that they already had to contend with, fire codes and fire regulations, ADA compliance issues, and then dealing with getting other utilities to the site. So redevelopment projects tend to be more complex, and the more complex the project, as we heard, the less influence it seems like that stormwater controls had in the overall cost of the project. So a lot of the areas of complexity that redevelopment projects contend with are pre-existing and surrounding infrastructure. That tends to be a lot more of an issue than on greenfield sites. There are a lot more limitations on what can be done with the site, often higher levels of uncertainty, and then there are other things that developers think about with redevelopment, like what can the market support, and what is the demand for the project. And often with redevelopment projects, there's demand because of their proximity to the central city, and that enters in as one factor that they really consider. And a greenfield site wouldn't be an appropriate trade-off if they're paying attention to that factor. Mixed uses, other larger, the redevelopment projects tend to be larger trophy projects in some cases, and they often overlap a lot with the demand for green building. And so a lot of these redevelopment projects already are tending toward being greener or LEED projects. And so there's often more willingness to pay for the low-impact development that is integrated into the redevelopment sites. So all of these factors kind of influence the difference between redevelopment and greenfield.
Sarah, do you want to address the chat question regarding the influence of stormwater costs?
Actually, that's slide 3. So let me.
It's a nice transition.
It is. It's great.
Good segue.
Somebody's reading ahead. Our third conclusion: the costs of low-impact development or green infrastructure tend to be more variable and site-specific for redevelopment versus greenfield development. So this gets at the concern that John mentioned, that part of that concern is cost going to be an issue here for redevelopment, and one of the things we found that developers were unwilling or unable to provide us with some type of rule of thumb about the proportion of stormwater costs to the total project cost. They said there's basically no one-size-fits-all solution, especially for redevelopment. The stormwater costs can be highly variable, and again, depending on those site-specific conditions, the soil, the slope, the vegetation, the constraints that you'll find, other constraints you'll find on a redevelopment setting. Now, greenfield sites were more adaptable, they told us, to cookie-cutter type approaches that lend themselves to greater efficiencies, meaning you'll have more units to spread the costs over, so the cost for any one unit might not be that much greater. A related point is that we did find that the cost of complying with the stormwater regulations can be greater in redevelopment than in greenfield. And it matters what type of low-impact development or green infrastructure or infiltration technology you can use on the site. Some cases where the sites, you can't really do infiltration, you may be forced to do a green roof, which can be a lot more expensive than other alternatives. And so that some developers express that concern. And another related point is that in redevelopment, in general, there's just greater uncertainty and higher risks and costs associated with the permitting process, because you're dealing with a site that is in a redevelopment setting. There are more constraints. The developers face this uncertainty. Well, if I don't get this design right the first time and it doesn't get past inspection, I'm going to have to go back and do re-engineering, redesign. That's going to be really expensive. And that was a concern for redevelopment that is much less of a concern for greenfield. So it's not that, back to Fred's question, as far as stormwater being in the mix, it just was in the mix, and there are many other factors in it, but no one really gave us a cost number or rule of thumb that we could use.
So that second part, I'm sorry to interrupt, the
Sure.
second part of his question, he didn't, whether there's a range that you could characterize.
Right. Varied. We asked that question, and it varied that they wouldn't put their finger on it. Okay, let's see. I'm looking at the question here.
The incorporation of trash or floating debris into stormwater regulations. California's been on the cutting edge of this. And did that enter into any of the discussion?
No, I don't know if John or Jeff can answer that one, but no, that didn't come up in our work.
This is Jeff. I'll jump in. It isn't something I've seen EPA consider to date in their discussions about a new national stormwater standard now.
Okay. Do you, how about if Ryan, can we open the line and see if we get any people who want to ask questions rather than type?
All attendees have been unmuted.
So based on the first three conclusions, is there anyone else that wants to ask specific questions about the research so far? Okay. They're all stunned, Ed. Okay. We're going to have that nice lady mute us again, and then Ed and Sarah, you'll need to...
All attendees have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Okay, moving right along to conclusion 4. Developers respond to benefits that influence their bottom line. And so this was one area that we were very interested in going into this, because low-impact development approaches often offer more benefits than conventional approaches to stormwater management. And when we're talking about this, it's really important to distinguish between public and private benefits here, because developers respond to a set of benefits that have the potential to affect their bottom line. These are the types of benefits that can offset any increased costs on the cost side of the equation, and any benefits that also influence the revenue side of the equation by increasing the sale price or rent. So LID often offers landscape amenities that look attractive, that create outdoor spaces that people can enjoy, and in theory, people may be willing to pay more for those, and that would influence the developer's decision. Another example, some BMPs like green roofs can, in some cases, create energy savings or reduce maintenance costs that might factor into that decision in some cases as well. So then there are other public benefits that don't typically factor in, but they're still important, and we'll get into that a little bit in the last slide when we talk about incentives and how municipalities can leverage those. So, ultimately the market demand drives the achievable sale price or rent, and if people don't perceive a benefit or aren't willing to pay more for some of these amenities that LID provides, they won't necessarily have much of an influence on developers' decision-making process. So in our questions, we asked, are you seeing that people are really screaming for these things, and is that why, are you considering incorporating them when you wouldn't otherwise? And some developers said that their customers are absolutely responding to that, especially when they're building LEED buildings or green buildings, and the customers understand and they want these kinds of things, and that helps justify any increased costs that might be there. But other developers, and these are on both coasts in both Olympia and the other two cities and county, they indicated that, for residential development, a lot of people don't understand the LID, and they actually like the look of the conventional curb and gutter design with sidewalks, and they don't understand, or they come into an LID development, and they don't want to deal with the increased maintenance costs of bioswale. So there was some mixed reaction there. But one thing that we did have people tell us was that they expect the demand for green and sustainable development and LID with that to increase over time. They're already beginning to see that, and as that happens, it will become a bigger factor in their decision-making process. So.
Okay, conclusion 5. So cost-effective responses to stronger stormwater standards requires a more collaborative approach to addressing stormwater management. This conclusion came out of when we would contrast the experiences of the different results we were finding, where some folks were telling us, yeah, we've got this, yeah, it's another hurdle, but it's, we're doing this. and then on the other end of the spectrum was, no, it can't be done. And so we started to ask, more about the differences here. And one reason why some developers believe that low-impact development or green infrastructure or higher infiltration on site can't be done is because they haven't had to deal with this in the past, and to deal with it is going to require a little bit different view or approach to stormwater management. For example, there are two main points here. One is the importance of collaboration, and we call it the difference between the silo mentality and the collaborative mentality. And the silo mentality or approach is the designer, the developer, the engineer, etc., are all doing their job. They do talk and interact, but they're doing their respective job, and they put the project together. If that's not really low impact development and higher infiltration in general doesn't work well with that approach. What works better, at least in these interviews, is what we call the collaborative approach, and that is these specialists, these different aspects of a project are brought together early on. You deal with all aspects of the project, you design, talk about, plan for all aspects of the project, including stormwater management, early on. This allows you to deal with, say, the new regulation easier and to be more flexible in the response, as opposed to in the silo approach, you've got this project pretty well developed, and now you come in with this new overlay of a new stormwater regulation on top, and it's almost too late. It's going to cost you more. It's going to be harder to do. So this issue of collaboration and flexibility go together, at least from the folks. For example, the folks that can do a LEED silver building at no extra cost, they use the collaborative approach. And they tell us it's more flexible and easier to deal with not just new stormwater regulations, but any kind of new tweak they have to deal with. And a final point, and this was news to us, but it was also very important, is we heard how important it is, the engineers, the civil engineers, how important they are to the whole design and build process, and that and a lot of engineers use a canned program, meaning they buy a software product that helps them do their job, but these software products can't handle green infrastructure or high infiltration alternatives. So when the developer turns to this type of engineer or an engineer with this training or approach and says, can we do these new stormwater regulations? The engineer says, no, it can't be done. Well, it can't be done. It's a training issue. It's a software issue. It's a knowledge issue. And obviously the folks who are doing LEED silver buildings at no extra cost are doing it, and they're doing it well at no extra cost. So there's a knowledge approach, even a software difference between this silo and collaborative approach, and we were just blown away by that. And in Montgomery County, we heard that the engineers that could deal with the new stormwater regulations could even charge a small premium for their services because so many people all of a sudden needed these new skills.
Ed, I just wanted to point out there's a thumbs up from Diane, who's a stormwater landscaper, saying that she's agreeing with this set of conclusions.
Okay, great. I like that.
Well, I'm interpreting the thumbs up. She didn't use it, but she gave us you can see her point. So.
Oh, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. So that kind of leads nicely into our conclusion 6, which is that market adjustments over time will help reduce the costs and enhance the benefits of implementing stronger stormwater standards. Developers are already, that we talked to, many of them are already seeing this happen and expect that this trend will continue. In places where the regulations have been in place a little bit longer, like in Philadelphia, we heard that developers are adapting to the new regulations, and that the regulations have created a demand for the type of expertise that's required to implement these things. It's also creating demand for new technological approaches and materials that accomplish these, accomplish infiltration and retention, and make it more feasible especially in more constrained sites. So So these services weren't available immediately, but as they became available, and as more people used them, the cost of complying with the stronger stormwater management regulations decreased. So the other shift that occurs is the perceptions of the techniques. Many developers and engineers we talked to said there's still a widespread perception, and Ed just spoke to this, that LID technologies don't work, that they're more risky than tried and true approaches. But as developers begin to have experience and see others doing this, they see, oh, well, I can make this work, and I can think about this in a different way and accomplish meet the regulations. The other piece of this that I talked about a little bit before is that consumers and market demand will shift, and people may not currently understand or value the services that LID provides, but as they understand them more or begin to become more familiar with the look of the new type of development, they'll begin to demand it more, and in some cases, there may be a higher willingness to pay for some of this. So, see, there's another.
Yep. Diane's just
Oh,
adding that she has actually worked with engineers
nice, yeah.
to try to help them understand how they can tweak the canned approach.
Great.
Any other questions? We'll open up the line after conclusion 7, but any other chat questions specifically on conclusion 6?
I don't remember if we get into this later, but one of the things that we heard about as a recommendation is the biggest thing that can influence the process is more training and education for the engineers. And if municipalities want to to influence the process, offering those types of services, workshops, and things is a good thing.
On Fred's question, when developers thought of LID, were they concentrating on BMPs, or we were focused on the new stormwater regulations, which required on-site, mostly required, the defining factor seemed to be on-site infiltration, a certain volume or amount of on-site infiltration. And so BMP, I guess it would be both, Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, some municipalities we found defined the range of LID BMPs and the way that they should look pretty carefully. Other jurisdictions were less specific, and this actually led to a point that I don't remember. Are we getting to it? I think we've passed. That increases the uncertainty, and developers really craved certainty. If we put in a rain garden, how can it look and where can we put it in? And so I guess that related to both the specific BMP and its design.
Yeah, a related point is if there were more of a handbook or some list of approved BMPs. Now, unfortunately, again, given the site-specific nature of the green infrastructure BMPs, as your conditions vary across a jurisdiction, it could be a lot of work, but if there were some approved list of BMPs by where you were in the city, that would greatly reduce that uncertainty that Sarah was describing. But that I guess that would require a lot of work, and I don't think any of these three had something that specific.
Not that specific. They I think all had stormwater management manuals or design standards that provided some guidance, but some of the feedback we got was that the interpretation of those standards and guidance was changing, and that created a lot of uncertainty where something that would fly in one development 2 years ago, wouldn't necessarily fly today, and just it was quite an effort for many of these developers to keep on top of that, and the engineers as well.
So Diane just added a couple points about the importance of the BMPs to the engineers, that they can develop their runoff numbers from specifics related to BMPs themselves, and then relating the kind of the broader design question to the site, that they have to, that there's different ways to do it, and that there's not only one way.
Got it. Right.
And then one more here from Fred. what he's seeing is LID means developing a site using traditional practices, then adding a rain garden or two. Result, we lose the benefits of LID design. And I guess getting back to your point, Ed, is that both of your points is that there's a need for both pieces, not just the plunk a rain garden in here and it solves the problem.
Right.
And for those developers who are really doing this successfully, they made this point over and over. You can't just plunk it down at the end on top,
Right.
overlaying. It doesn't often work, and it will be more expensive to do it that way in many cases.
And the higher probability they won't get it approved, or is that what you mean by it won't work?
Or yeah.
Or approved, yeah, through the well, will it pass muster with the inspectors?
Okay, why don't you guys move on to 7 and we'll open up.
Last conclusion before we open it up in general. So back to the question about incentives. Developers are supportive of incentives that ease the transition. All the jurisdictions had some type of fast-track permitting for redevelopment projects that exceeded the minimum regulatory requirements. So our impression is that the jurisdictions really were trying to help this happen, make the new regulations work. In fact, some went out, just as an aside, I think was it Philadelphia, one of the jurisdictions actually went out around knocking on developers' doors before the regulations were, or as they were developing the regulations, asking for their input. They didn't really get much input, but they really tried to do outreach and get input. Back to subsidies. Philadelphia has a stormwater fee offset program so that the fee is now based on the area of imperviousness on a site. And again, the new regulations will help reduce the amount of impervious area, and then the property owner will see a reduction in their fee. Other jurisdictions had a direct subsidy for specific LED controls. For example, for green roofs, there'd be a specific dollar subsidy. And another thing that surprised us is that many developers were strongly supportive of some type of fee in lieu of or credit offset program as a final alternative, meaning if they just couldn't make it work on a redevelopment site and it would just be very, very expensive, could they in effect buy restoration credits for a project somewhere else in the watershed? And Philadelphia has a fee in lieu of program, but it's really used because it's usually cheaper for the developers to comply with the regulation. That was their take. So that's the end of the conclusions. And just our last slide. Here's our funders and partners as well.
So Ryan, if we could open up the lines, we can have some more questions.
All attendees have been unmuted.
I know not everybody's on the line, but if you are on the line and you'd like to chime in, you can either jump in until we get a free-for-all and then we could raise hands, or you could keep typing and we could raise to the group your question here. Diane has added the point that echoes on what you were just saying, Ed, about the assessment of a site and understanding the infiltration qualities to know what the mix of conventional and low-impact development or more green options are necessary to deal with the volume and of the stormwater runoff and the appropriate site conditions. So is there anybody else that I see some typing happening. Anybody else want to jump in with specific questions on the 7 conclusions that came out of this study?
This is Tim Guilfoyle. I have a question or just an observation and maybe need some help. I'm looking at several different markets, Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, and just most recently Pittsburgh. And I'm finding that the engineering, the planning, the construction companies are, sort of in 2 camps. One is the traditional, more gray infrastructure, very strongly gray infrastructure, and the others there are emerging companies around green infrastructure. But the gray infrastructure folks have enormous political power, and it's they perceive that it's in their strong best interest to continue to latch onto the gray infrastructure because they perceive they're making a whole lot more money than they would the other way, and therefore there are political contributions. In Louisville, there have actually been some bribes, and so on and so forth. So one of the challenges that we're facing is that dynamic. I mean, I hear what you're saying about the conclusions that you reach, and I think you did a great job of going out and researching this, and I don't disagree with your conclusions at all. But there's a political climate out there, at least in the markets that I'm working in, that is just overwhelming, and we're really struggling with how to overcome that.
Fred, that's what you
That's Tim.
Oh, I'm sorry. Tim.
Yeah, with the Sierra Club. Yep.
That what you describe isn't surprising to us. I'd actually like to ask Jeff or John. I mean, I'm assuming if EPA comes out with the regulation that you're focused on at the moment, I'm assuming that would address some of that local political influence.
I think that's the reason why we need national regulation, stronger national regulation on this issue.
I entirely agree with John. I mean, one of the purposes of Clean Water Act regulations, and it's built into the statute and built into the legislative history, is that it's a tool for forcing the development of new technologies to respond to.
Jeff, you're getting a little muffled. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. It's a tool for forcing technologies to respond to emerging issues of concerns about pollution, and certainly the establishment of a national standard that drives strong infiltration, high infiltration levels will go some way to addressing this.
And Tim, this is John Zeidler. I mean, one of the reasons we did this was to try to get, for the very reason that you're talking about, is to try to come up, that our groups can come up with a more unified position on the impact on redevelopment, so that we can counter what's going to be a big push against any kind of national regulation. By essentially coming up with some new or additional data or additional, at least, this study supports at least the argument that within these couple of jurisdictions that have very strong standards requiring green infrastructure, that given the various mechanisms in place and the flexibility for redevelopment that's in place from these communities, you're not seeing this kind of doomsday scenario, which there was some concern about. So we're hoping that this will help counter that constituency.
Well, I would just too, and I do agree with the need for national regulation, but I also recognize that implementation is going to be equally difficult. And we're finding that in consent decrees for CSOs. I mean, we've got a lot of federal consent decrees out there, but attempting to implement them is just also overwhelming. So I'm going to shut up now.
No, you're right. It's going to take some time to, there's likely to be some kind of a, this is Gail with River Network, some kind of a timing that it will phase in, and then we'll be on the ground trying to, as you all will be on the ground too, trying to figure out how to make sure it's happening according to plan. So I think that's a really good point, Tim. And one of the things about the political element is that that going back to one of the conclusions, that idea that it can't be done is driven by the folks who kind of, the bigger developers who have the engineers in place who aren't as informed about these techniques, and they come to their client and say, we can't do it that way. And so it is, I think there's a point that's been raised here on the chat. It's about the education process of the engineering community and the development community, but that's also a slow process. Anybody else have a question about one of the specific conclusions or the overall use of the research? How do folks feel like they might be able to use this research locally? Would you like to have it done locally?
Yes.
We're working on Louisville, Tim.
Well, it's Pittsburgh, it's a number of markets. But the reason is because I think, people in these individual markets are making individual kinds of conclusions. For instance, in Pittsburgh, we just heard that one of the arguments that the building community is making is, green infrastructure won't work because there's too much clay.
Right, we heard that as well.
So focusing on individual markets, I think, it is going to be somewhat important because they do vary.
Mm-hmm.
It's also just having the skills and the materials available to do the kinds of things that are involved in these BMPs. And that's one thing we ran into in your neighborhood, Tim. Folks just, it's not as easy to get the materials.
I agree. But I think
that,
your information is going to be extraordinarily valuable. Anytime we have something that's well-researched like this adds to our knowledge base and the information that we can articulate to our community leaders and our communities in general. So I applaud your efforts.
Diane does have a question here, and it might be for Jeff. How does anybody feel about ordinance modifications to encourage the kinds of changes that we're talking about? The kinds of information, the kinds of, especially the political influence.
Well, that's actually a really interesting wrinkle. EPA can set a national standard that will require stormwater management at a certain performance level, but that's going to have to be implemented back down at the local level through ordinance modification, or work for us will often be in convincing states and localities to update their stormwater design manuals, and arguing again for performance or for BMPs that are responsive to site constraints, whether it's clay, soils, or rocky soils or steep slopes. So ordinance modification, getting back into the building codes, which are often the source of challenges for green infrastructure LID approaches. We're operating at kind of the 30,000-foot level here with EPA standards, and it's going to come home locally.
We have a new long question and comment here from Cynthia. Did you learn of any situations where managing stormwater on site with pollutant removal before infiltration was physically impossible? Conservation Law Foundation has used legal action to generate new stormwater permitting programs for commercial and industrial development that will require retrofits of existing development as well as controls on new development. This information will be helpful in our efforts.
I don't think we heard of a project that
Were things physically impossible?
Yeah, I can't think of a good example. There were some that were certainly more difficult and required them to move up the, with
right.
green roofs and water capture, but
Hey, and this is where Sarah's point early on, it'd be really interesting to see 3 years down the road what happens, presuming the economy comes back, the real estate market comes back, and there's more development going on. It'd be interesting to see, is there a redevelopment site where, it's just not going to work and that site won't be developed because of the regulation. In our interviews, we didn't find that situation, but
the point was also made that there's been very little activity in moving